Hey guys, welcome back to New Nanny Workshop.
Hey everyone, welcome back. You'll remember from the last video I was cladding my garden wall. If you haven't seen that video, there's a link at the top of the screen. As you can see, it was in a bit of a state before I started. The top capping was wearing out and the cladding had blown in a few places, or rather the rendering. So I decided I would clad the whole thing with shiplap and trim the corners and change the top of the wall to something with a bit of an overhang. And obviously the overhang distance had changed because of the cladding, so it needed to be something slightly wider. So I went with 1x6s, and these are the 1x6s that I bought from a local timber supplier. So there's a bit of cleanup to do before I actually started, where I took off the old boards. The old boards were leftover decking from the deck you can see on the top right hand corner there. There was quite a lot of muck and stuff that had got down between them, so I gave everything a good clean up. First thing I did was lay two of the planks on to check for centering and to see what sort of an overhang I would need to put on them in order to make it an effective cover. You'll see though that where the wall is slightly wider at one end than the other, that it's going to need some sort of trim underneath the overhang at some point. I'm not too panicky about that at the moment. I'm just going to get the appearance sorted first, but obviously I need something to cover that up just for aesthetic purposes really. That board, in case you're wondering, had a defect on one side, and obviously on the outside edge I can't afford to have defects because I'm going to be rounding the edges over and actually staining the whole thing, so any place where there's a break in the wood will look not quite how I expected it to or how I wanted it to. So I'm pretty happy at this point with how the overhang is going to look, but I do need to look at it closely and try and get these centered up over that wall. Now the wall is a fairly uniform width, which is handy, so I went with an overhang that would accommodate the corner posts as well. There's going to be a trim on that corner which you saw in an earlier photograph, and obviously I need the overhang to cover that as well. So this is me checking with the corner cover in place, and I'm also checking more or less where I would need to cut the boards off for length as well. Obviously they need to overhang around that corner too. And here comes my glamorous assistant. This is Jazz. Jazz loves me. Jazz likes to hang around and watch what I'm doing all the time. In fact, he follows me everywhere. He's got to check what I'm doing. He's more like a foreman than an assistant really. He does like to oversee what's going on. He also likes to take charge of the other dogs. Archie's the old boy. He's 14. So the corner parts of these walls on the inside are not perfect 45s or not perfect 90-degree angles, so obviously laying on like this is a good way to check for what the miter angle needs to be, and essentially it's just a matter then of measuring from the corner of the board to the inside corner of the wall and making the cut along that line and doing the same on the other side. And the reason that's easier is because, as I said, they're not perfect 45s. You're never going to cut a 45-degree angle on these boards and expect them to join up. So my next step was to clamp both the boards together to stop them moving around in relation to each other, because obviously they're going to need to link up to each other once I make cuts on them. And you'll see that I've trimmed the end off just past the corner trim in order to get the overhang right at the end. What I'm doing is checking that they're butted up together at the end, and I've got a fine drill bit to make some pilot holes in the wood but this is also a good way to mark the top of the wall in order for the holes I'm going to have to drill to secure them down. So what I do is drill through with a fine bit, put it on hammer setting so that it makes a hole or like an indent in the top of the wall, so I've got a reference point for drilling in to put rule plugs in order to be able to attach the planks to the top of the wall. Obviously you guys don't really want to sit through me doing that, do you? So the next step was to take all the clamps off and remove one plank at a time in order for the other plank to give you a reference point to replace it, and I cut the mitre on one of those and placed it back in place so that I could move the second board without changing the position of them too much. A few millimetres really isn't going to make an awful lot of difference, but if you can keep them still, it does help. Now, in order to cut the mitres on the end, I've marked a line on the board, and I'm going to be using a cutting guide for my circular saw, and it looks something like this. If anyone's interested in how you make one of those, then leave a comment down below, and if I get enough comments about it, then I'll do a video specifically on that. So then it's just a matter of clamping the guide against the line, and the offset is enough for your blade to run along the edge of the board, so you know that it's always going to cut along that line. Useful for long boards like this really, because it's very difficult if you've got a rather small mitre saw station, which I have, to place those boards on the table and support them at the other end. I actually should invest in or build some support trestles if I ever get a chance, and that's certainly something I'm going to consider in the future. So I've cut my mitre, the two should match up when I put this back in place, but obviously the first thing I need to do is think about drilling the pilot holes into the wall in order to be able to put the plugs in so that I can attach the planks down. I'm careful to try and get these holes as vertical as I possibly can. Obviously when you put the screws in through the boards, if they're in at an angle, they're going to look unsightly, and countersinking them is going to be difficult. Now, because I'm going to be sanding the top of this cladding down, I don't need any screw heads poking up above the surface that I can catch with the sander, and if I choose to plane them, which I may do, there may need to be quite an aggressive start to any material removal. Then the last thing I want to do is catch my planer blade on any of these screws, because that will destroy it, and they're not cheap. You'll notice I'm drilling these holes quite deeply, and the reason for that is it's a good tactic with a project like this where you're securing into walls. Sometimes to give yourself a better anchor, what you can do is put shorter rule plugs in, and a longer screw will force the far ends of the rule plugs out in order to give you a better anchor in the wall. It's not absolutely necessary for a project like this, but I feel that if it gets knocked by the dogs or people are standing on the edges of it, it's a good way to stop it from levering out of the wall. It does make it a bit more difficult to take them out later on if you need to, but hopefully this project will stand for a few years. So there was a little piece of concrete on top of the wall there that was sticking up. It was so tiny, I don't really know why I felt the need to get rid of that, because levelling a plank this size, it's really going to make no difference at all. I was being a bit over particular, I think. So I placed the plank back into the same spot that I took it out from, and you'll notice there's a gap at the far end, which I spotted. And now there's a gap at this end. This could have made an entire set of outtakes if I hadn't had the sense to spot it straight away. In fact, I could have gone backwards and forwards all day probably. So I'm using 2.5-inch decking screws, and they're the green coloured screws, and the main reason I use these is because if you stone over the top of them, they tend to pretty much disappear. And the 2.5 screws, as I said, the idea is that they're long enough to penetrate right through those rule plugs I've put in and anchor the thing to the wall, and it does pin it down quite nice and tight. This is quite handy if you've got a bowed plank. You can offset the holes for the screws and use the screws to pull it straight sometimes, and I've employed that on the mid planks, and you'll see that later in the video. It's worth noting that the top of that wall in places was blown quite badly, so some of the rule plugs didn't actually anchor in the wall very well. What I needed to do then was drive a wooden dowel in first and then re-drill them, and that seemed to do the trick. Now on this side, as I said earlier, you can see that the planks I've got here are not completely straight and there are some gaps. In order to combat that, I was having a look to see which edges were the most likely to make it as small as possible first, but then I am going to have to push them against the backboard in order to drill the holes in the right place to make sure that they get pulled into line once I drive in the screws. Same process was involved. I just went through, drilled the pilot holes in the wall for the initial drilling for the rule plugs, and then went ahead and hammer drilled the holes for the rule plugs into the wall at quite short intervals on this plank because it's considerably longer than the other one. In fact, there's almost a full length plank on this. Bit of a clean up first. You have to be careful doing this because you can fill the holes back in with dust and then you can't find them. Same process again, I just went through, tapped in the rule plugs. Again, they're slightly shorter than the screws for the reasons I talked about before. And then the process is pretty much the same really.
Hi, I'm sure you're aware this video is dragging on a bit now. We're well past the 10-minute mark, and I don't want to bore you all in one go, so I made a decision to split this video into 2 separate videos again. And so if you're interested in seeing the continuation, click the link here or wherever it ends up being. And if you enjoyed it and you found something useful in it, then give a thought to liking and subscribing if you don't mind. I'm always grateful. And any comments, please feel free to leave them. I read all of them. If there's something you want to know, or there's something I can help with, then I'll do my best to help with that. And I'll see you in the next video.